Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Prism Pod. I'm Jack Cadman, founder of Prism Consulting Group. I spend my time helping defence and security companies, especially SMEs, scale-ups and international entrants, translate strong capability into decisions inside UK defence. The Prism Pod is where I unpack the structural realities that shape procurement, assurance and momentum, and turn them into practical doctrine you can actually use. No reform theatre, no generic advice, just clear patterns, what they mean in practice, and how to move through the system in a way that survives scrutiny. Let me begin with a claim that will feel uncomfortable to some people, not because it's provocative, but because it contradicts a story that much of the defence industry has quietly internalised. UK defence does not struggle to move. It is not slow because it is broken, incompetent, or resistant to change. It is slow because at a structural level, it is designed to neutralise momentum until movement feels safe. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this conversation. If you work in the defence industry, especially if you're an SME, a scale-up, or an international company trying to establish yourself in the UK market, you will already recognise the symptoms. Long periods of apparent interest that never quite convert, pilots that feel encouraging but fail to scale, senior conversations that sound positive yet never harden into a decision, or programs that appear to gather momentum only to stall just as progress feels close. The instinctive explanation is that something has gone wrong, that the system has stalled, or that someone has lost interest. Maybe even that perhaps the capability was not explained clearly enough, or the right stakeholders were not engaged early enough. In most cases, none of this is true. What is actually happening is far more consistent and far more predictable than most companies are prepared to accept. The system is doing exactly what it was built to do. It is slow moving until safety, consensus, and institutional cover are restored. And unless you understand that dynamic, every attempt to push harder will tend to increase the very resistance you are trying to overcome. This is not an argument for delay. It is an argument for movement that survives scrutiny. This episode is about those underlying dynamics, not procurement mechanics, not reform rhetoric, but the structural truths beneath defence that shape behaviour, decisions, and outcomes, whether anyone names them or not. Once you understand those truths, something important shifts. You stop asking why defence will move, and you start asking what would make movement feel safe. That change in framing is not cosmetic, it is decisive. By the end of the episode, you should be able to do 3 things more clearly than before. First, diagnose why an engagement that looks healthy on the surface could be potentially stalling underneath. Second, identify which lever matters next, rather than default to more meetings, more slides, or more chasing. And third, act in a way that restores movement without triggering the system's instincts to protect itself. This is not about working harder inside defence. It is about working in a way that the system can absorb. Part 1. Safety and the neutralisation of movement. The most important behavioural law in UK defence is also the least openly acknowledged. Defence prevents movement until safety, consensus or political cover is restored. It is important to be precise about what safety means here, because this is where many companies misunderstand the system. Safety in defence is not primarily about physical safety, and it is not limited to technical or engineering safety. It is institutional safety. The confidence that a decision will not expose an individual, a team, or a department to blame, scrutiny, or career risk if something later goes wrong. This is not about bad people. It is about rational behaviour inside a scrutinised system. You can see this form of safety at work everywhere. It shows up as requests for pilots rather than commitments. It shows up as language like not yet, not proven, or not in this cycle. And it shows up in the quiet accumulation of assurance steps that seem disproportionate to the capability being discussed. None of this is accidental though. Defence is a public system operating under intense scrutiny, asymmetric accountability, and long memory. The downsides of being wrong is far greater than the upside of being early. Over time, systems adapt to those incentives. UK defence has done so consistently. This is why movement is treated as something that must be justified rather than assumed. Most companies respond to this behaviour in exactly the wrong way. They interpret caution as obstruction and respond with urgency. They push for decisions, They escalate emotionally. They add more claims, more slides, more promises. In doing so, they make the system feel less safe. The companies that succeed behave very differently. They anticipate the safety deficit before it is articulated. They pre-build governance. They write justification before persuasion. They offer reversible paths rather than irreversible asks. They articulate not just what could go right, but what would happen if it went wrong, and how that risk would be contained. Consequence is subtle but powerful. Instead of asking defence to take a risk, they allow defence to feel that risk is being reduced, and that is the moment when movement becomes possible. If the next step requires someone to defend it in a room you're not in, you have not made it safe yet. Here is the pattern in action and what changes when companies stop trying to persuade and start trying to make movement defensible. To make this tangible, imagine a company that had several constructive conversations with defence and is now being asked for a bit more assurance before progressing. The instinctive response, and one many of you will already recognise, is to prepare more material, a deeper technical brief, a longer slide deck, perhaps a stronger push to show confidence. The counterintuitive move is to do less, but more precisely. Instead of adding content, the company prepares a short internal style note that frames the next step as explicitly reversible. It states what risk is reduced by taking that step, what risk remains, and under what conditions this activity would stop. It also ends with a forward line written for the reader, not for you. A short paragraph they can copy and paste into an internal email without editing, because the easiest way to create safety is to remove the effort of justification at the point where it is most politically exposed. Nothing about the capability changes. What changes is the exposure profile of the person who has to say yes. They are no longer being asked to commit, only to allow a controlled reduction in uncertainty. That shift is often enough to unlock movement, not because the system is persuaded, but because it finally feels safe. Part 2. Momentum as a survival mechanism. Once safety is understood, the next concept that needs to be re-examined is momentum. Momentum is one of the most misunderstood ideas in UK defence. It is often mistaken for energy, urgency, or persistence. It is not how excited people sound on the last call, how senior the meeting was, or how often you follow up. Momentum in defence is a pattern of behaviour that makes stopping feel riskier than continuing. You can recognise real momentum by its effects. Updates become expected rather than requested. Stakeholders start referencing your material in conversations you're not in. Questions shift from "why are we doing this?" to "how would this work in practice?" Silence shortens, not because people are enthusiastic, but because they feel a responsibility to respond. The absence of momentum is equally recognisable. Weeks pass without contact. Each meeting reopens basic questions. Stakeholders ask for reassurance rather than next steps. Nobody explicitly says no, but nothing actually moves. Most companies respond to this absence by doing exactly what makes it worse. They push for larger meetings. They escalate to senior levels prematurely. They flood the system with information. Each of these actions increase uncertainty and gives the system more reason to pause. The companies that maintain momentum behave in almost the opposite way. They create a predictable cadence of small, controlled actions. Short evidence updates every few weeks. Narrowly scoped pilots rather than broad proposals. Clear next steps that are easier to say yes than to defer. The rhythm does not feel urgent, it feels inevitable, and that is precisely why it works. The consequence is not speed in the conventional sense, it is continuity. The program stays alive, it remains visible, it continues to reduce perceived risk rather than accumulating it. That is why momentum is not optional in defence. It is a survival mechanism. Without it, even good ideas suffocate under their own weight. Everything you've heard so far is a different expression of the same underlying rule. Defence only moves when movement feels safer than stillness. When companies understand momentum as inevitability rather than effort, their behaviour changes in subtle but decisive ways. Consider a company that feels momentum slipping. Emails take longer to be answered, meetings keep happening, but nothing quite advances. Most companies respond by chasing harder. They request more senior time, circulate reminders, or ask directly whether the defence is still interested. That instinct is understandable, and it is usually fatal. A more effective move is to assume silence means uncertainty, not disinterest. Instead of chasing the company introduces a predictable cadence. Every 3 or 4 weeks, a short evidence note is sent, each one deliberately reducing a single named risk. Each evidence note ends the same way. A single sentence that makes the next step easier to agree than to defer, and a second sentence written so the recipient can forward it upward without rewriting it. That is not about nudging. It is about removing friction at the exact moment momentum normally dies. Over time, something subtle will happen. Stakeholders stop asking for updates because they start expecting them. The program develops continuity. Silence becomes uncomfortable, not normal. And momentum is restored not through urgency, but through inevitability. Part 3. The myth of the centre of gravity. Even when safety and momentum are understood, many companies still fail because they misunderstand where authority actually sits. Another illusion that undermines more pursuits than poor technology ever will is the belief that there is a single centre of gravity inside UK defence. There is not. Authority is distributed across a fragmented landscape of actors, each of whom controls a different dimension of progress. For example, DE&S shape assurance tempo, frontline commands shape requirement flow. Technical authorities shape risk language. Commercial teams control process. Ministers influence political timing. Users control operational credibility. And digital and integration authorities constrain feasibility. The practical consequence of this distribution is that no single individual can guarantee momentum. Senior sponsorship helps, but it does not substitute for alignment. Decisions rarely fail because one person says no. They fail because enough people feel uncertain enough to do nothing. Do not confuse senior enthusiasm with system alignment. Most companies chase access. They look for the decision maker. They believe that senior buy-in will carry the program forward. When it does not, they become frustrated and confused. The companies that succeed ask a different question. Instead of asking who decides, they ask who must be aligned so that progress is not quietly undone later. They map influence rather than hierarchy. They identify who will be consulted behind closed doors, who will review paperwork late in the progress, and who needs to see evidence early in order to shape opinion rather than react to it. Rather than addressing these concerns reactively, they surface them early. They sequence engagement so that the actors most likely to object later are engaged sooner, not later. Comfort is then fed forward through the system, rather than chased after the fact. The result is progress that holds, not because everyone is enthusiastic, but because nobody feels compelled to intervene to stop it. This is what happens when companies stop optimizing for sponsorship and start designing for alignment. Think of a situation where a senior sponsor appears supportive, but progress keeps stalling later in the process. The natural conclusion is that the sponsor needs to push harder. In practice, though, this often makes things worse. Quiet objections surface downstream, framed as technical concerns or integration issues or commercial constraints. A different approach is to work backwards. Instead of strengthening the sponsor, the company engages the actor or actors most likely to raise a late objection. One higher thinking move here is to ask that blocker a question that is deliberately easier than agreement. Not are you comfortable, but what would make you uncomfortable later if we did not surface it now? Correction is lower friction than commitment, and it flushes out hidden veto logic before it hardens into delay. By addressing that concern early and feeding the comfort forward, the sponsor is no longer exposed later. The system aligns without escalation. The outcome feels counterintuitive, but it is reliable. Progress holds because nothing is left waiting to block it. Part 4. Predictability and what defense actually buys. Here is where companies with genuinely brilliant technology are still capable of losing. Once authority is understood as distributed, the next mistake companies make is assuming that performance alone will carry the day. One of the most commercially important insights in UK defence is also one of the most resisted. Defence does not buy innovation, it buys predictability. Predictability does not mean reliability alone, and it does not mean technical maturity in isolation. Predictability means bounded, explainable behaviour under stress, misuse, integration, and scale. It means that defence can anticipate not just how a system performs when everything goes well, but how it behaves when things go wrong. You can see defence searching for predictability in the questions it asks. Questions about failure modes, integration boundaries, degraded performance, and misuse scenarios. These questions are not attempts to undermine a solution. They are attempts to make it governable. Most companies respond poorly. They oversell. They present idealised scenarios. They hide limitations. In doing so, they increase uncertainty and force defense to interrogate harder. Do not hide limitations. Hidden limitations become late-stage fear. The companies that succeed do the opposite. They surface limits early. They describe failure calmly. They explain what the system does not do as clearly as what it does. This builds confidence because it allows defense to reason about the capability rather than fear it. Predictability, in this sense, is not the enemy of innovation. It is the mechanism that allows innovation to be absorbed. When companies treat predictability as something to be demonstrated rather than defended, the tone of engagement changes immediately. Picture a meeting where defense keeps probing edge cases. What happens if the system degrades? How does it behave under misuse? Where are its limits? Many companies interpret this as skepticism and respond by doubling down on performance claims. In reality, the questions are a request for reassurance. A powerful and rarely used move is to answer a question defense has not yet asked. The company proactively explains limitation, calmly, precisely, without apology. One compounding addition is to pair that limitation with the bounded operating envelope that defense can reuse internally. Not a narrative, a simple sentence. Within these conditions, behavior is predictable. Outside them, this is what happens. It turns fear into something governable. This often changes the tone of the conversation immediately. Interrogation gives way to reasoning. Defense start treating the system as something it can understand rather than something it must test aggressively. Predictability is established not by proving perfection, but by bounding imperfection. Part 5. Defense as a risk conversion engine. At this point, a deeper pattern becomes visible. Defense is not a buyer in the conventional sense. It is a risk conversion engine. Risk inside defense is not experienced primarily as commercial or technical risk. It is experienced as reputational exposure, procedural vulnerability, and accountability risk within a public institution. Risk shows up as hesitation, as requests for more assurance, as deferral rather than rejection, or as additional layers of governance. Many of the individuals involved are personally committed. The system they sit in makes certain outcomes more likely. Most companies respond by arguing value. They explain benefits more loudly. They justify cost. They present upside. These arguments rarely land because they do not address the risk being carried by the stakeholder. The companies that succeed make a fundamental shift. They stop thinking like sellers and start thinking like risk reducers. They frame every interaction around a simple question. Which risk are we reducing today? Operational risk, assurance risk, commercial risk, or reputational risk. They make progress legible by summarizing it clearly. What risk was reduced today? How it was reduced? What the next safe step is? Over time, this trains the system to see movement as cumulative rather than speculative. Defense begins to feel predictable, not because it's simple, but because its incentives have become legible. If you cannot name the risk you retired this week in one sentence, defense cannot justify moving. This is the practical difference between selling value and actively retiring risk. Think about how most defense meetings end. A recap of benefits, a restatement of interest, agreement to keep talking. What is often missed is clarity. Sometimes no one leaves knowing whether anything is safer than it was now or earlier. A simple but powerful intervention is to end the meeting by naming the risk that was reduced, explicitly. Today we reduced assurance risk around X by doing Y. The next unresolved risk is Z. One superhuman move is to ask the stakeholder to correct that statement rather than agree with it. What have I missed? Or what would you phrase differently? Correction is safer than commitment, but it still forces the real risk logic into the open. This does two things. It makes progress visible, and it gives defense language they can reuse internally. Over time, meetings stop feeling repetitive and start feeling cumulative, because risk is being retired, not just discussed. Part 6. Translation as competitive advantage. All of this leads to the factor that will shape the next decade of defense more than any single technology, and that's translation capacity. Translation in this context is not communication or messaging, it is the systemic conversion of the same underlying reality into formats that different parts of the system can safely consume. You can recognize effective translation when defense conversations become smoother, when stakeholders appear aligned despite different priorities, when internal discussions progress without constant re-explanation. Poor translation produces the opposite effect. Confusion persists, meetings repeat, stakeholders talk past one another. Good capability fails quietly, not because it is wrong, but but because it is illegible. The companies that invest in translation do not have better slides. They have better artifacts. Evidence structured for the right audience. Narratives adapted to the actor, not the capability. Pace matched to governance rather than imposed on it. The discipline is consistency. The truth does not change, only the format does. When this is done well, the system can finally see the capability clearly, through its own lenses. Here is what changes when companies stop trying to be clear and start trying to be legible. Consider a company that feels it keeps explaining the same thing to different defense audiences, only to receive inconsistent reactions. The instinct is to refine the master narrative, make it clearer, make it simpler. The more effective move is to abandon this idea of a single narrative altogether. Instead, the company produces distinct artifacts for different actors, each one exposing the same truth in a form that actors can use. One tweak is to design those artifacts to be quoted, not read. A sponsor needs a paragraph that can be lifted into a submission. A technical authority needs a bounded statement of behaviour and failure mode. A commercial team needs a sentence that makes a route to contract defensible. If your work cannot be reused verbatim, it is harder for the system to move with it. When this works, something remarkable happens. Internal defense conversations become aligned without the company being present. Translation succeeds when defense can talk to itself clearly about you. Part 7. Learning velocity and governance drag. If you only take one idea into 2026, take this one. The final dynamic ties all the others together. Progress in defense occurs when learning cycles run faster than governance drag. Learning velocity is the speed at which a company can test, adapt, and improve. Governance drag is the speed at which assurance, approvals, and process operates. When learning outruns governance, capability evolves. When governance outruns learning, capability stagnates. Most companies either move fast and alarm the system or slow down and lose advantage. The companies that succeed separate internal speed from external presentation. They iterate rapidly, but release change in controlled, governance-safe increments. They make learning visible. They show what changed, why it changed, what evidence supports it, and what remains stable. Iteration is framed as maturity rather than instability. The consequence is decisive. Defense begins to see progress rather than churn. Requirements are shaped rather than chased. And the company stays ahead of the system without triggering its defensive instincts. This is what it looks like when learning speed is preserved without triggering governance resistance. Finally, imagine a fast-moving company iterating rapidly in response to feedback, but sensing growing discomfort from defense. The obvious fear is that speed itself is the problem. The usual response is to slow down. A more effective approach is to separate internal pace from external signaling. Internally, iteration continues. Externally, learning is released in deliberate, governance-safe intervals, each one clearly explaining what changed and what did not. One move is to present each release as a stability statement as much as a change statement. What remained the same? What is now locked? What will not change for the next cycle? Governance drag is often triggered less by change itself than by the fear of uncontrolled change. This reframes adaptation as control rather than volatility. Defense sees maturity, not churn. Learning stays ahead of governance without triggering the system's instinct to apply the brakes. So let us bring this together. Defense does not move slowly because it is lazy or indifferent. It moves cautiously because it is designed to survive. There is no center of gravity to capture, only alignment to build. Defense does not buy innovation, it buys predictability. Momentum is not optional, it is oxygen. Risk reduction is the real currency. Translation is the real advantage. Learning velocity is the real edge. The goal is speed with legitimacy, not speed that collapses under governance. If your engagement is stalling, diagnose whether safety is missing or momentum is decaying. If you do not know what levers matter next, ask who can quietly veto and which risks they are carrying. If you want movement without triggering resistance, translate the same truth into formats that systems can reuse. Once you understand this, the system stops feeling hostile. It starts feeling legible, and legibility is power. Understanding these dynamics is the first step. Acting differently is the second. That is what Prism exists to help companies do, not by changing defense, but by engaging it as it actually is. We help companies turn these principles into artifacts, cadence, and engagement design that defense can actually move with.